In the city of Bellevue, Washington, where Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos own lakeside homes, one homeowner finally got their property back after a 2.5-year legal battle to evict unlawful tenants. During that time, the tenants lived rent-free in a $2 million home at the expense of the property owner and of taxpayers. In February, the tenants were finally evicted and the family got their home back. This Bellevue squatter saga rose to national infamy. The story was followed by millions on social media, and I'll break down the policy and ideological environment that allowed this 2.5-year free housing stint to happen. But I also want to talk about how this story poses an uncomfortable challenge to the idea that housing is a human right. First, let's walk through the facts of this case. In July 2022, the Kim family, allegedly a dual-income household, signed a 9-month lease on the Bellevue home and paid the first month's rent of $4,400. That was, however, the first and last time they paid rent. Over the course of the next 30 months, the homeowners, a first-generation immigrant family, filed 4 separate eviction cases, each of which were drawn out for months at a time and then dismissed when a taxpayer-funded legal assistance group called the Housing Justice Project paid their back rent. Renters in King County have a right to free eviction assistance and legal representation, and they enjoy a right to remain housed at the expense of the property owner during the eviction process. And thanks to a backlog of at least 2,000 cases, it's not unusual for these eviction processes to drag on for months and even years in King County. That's just some of the policy environment facing landlords and tenants here, but we also face a brazenly anti-landlord rhetorical environment, where landlords are always the villains and tenants are always the victims. One of the clearest examples of this is when a renter in Seattle opened fire on sheriffs as they arrived to serve an eviction. One sheriff was critically injured. The tenant proceeded to barricade themselves in the unit and then tragically committed suicide. The response in Seattle was to organize a Take Back Your Power protest in honor of the tenant. And the Seattle Democratic Socialists of America released a statement following this incident calling for, quote, mass resistance against evictions and blaming the fatality on, quote, the violent character of our capitalist housing system, which prioritizes the profits of landlords over the human right to housing. The human right to housing. What does that mean? Well, to different people, it means different things. To its more moderate proponents, a human right to housing means the freedom to access housing, to not have your property taken from you, and to a government safety net for those in the most financial need. The United Nations details a right to housing in international law as a kind of mix of protections against government interference and also the provision of goods and resources, with a somewhat vague standard of progressive achievement towards the full realization of a right to housing. Well, the right to purchase, rent, enjoy, or sell property in freedom without government interference or intrusion is clearly protected by the U.S. Constitution as property rights. And property rights are viewed in our founding documents as unalienable human rights. When we sift property rights protections out of the obligations created by a supposed human right to housing, and we set those aside as already clearly protected human rights, what we're left with is a right to the government provision of housing. And the most ardent supporters of human right to housing are very clear about the government obligation to provide housing as an entitlement. Scholars Peter Marcuse and David Madden argue in their book In Defense of Housing that in order to treat housing as a fundamental human right, it must be removed from the market entirely and distributed freely regardless of income or wealth. The authors recommend increased public ownership of land and housing first policy, which provides fully subsidized housing with no strings attached for indefinite periods of time. And if you're wondering, as you should be, how the US or any society could guarantee the provision of housing to its citizens as an unalienable right on par with the right to life or speech or liberty, I'd like to point you back to the Bellevue squatter saga. Because therein lies the answer. A guarantee to the provision of housing requires a violation of property rights. Even the right we've created here to remain housed for 2.5 years without paying rent during the eviction process infringes very clearly on the right of a landlord to the use of their home. When America's founders declared that humans are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they didn't have in mind an unalienable right to live in a $2 million home at the sole cost of the property owner and taxpayers. The Bellevue squatter story is just one of many similar stories playing out in the Seattle region and across the nation as lawmakers pursue policies that intend to increase access to housing and instead trample on the fundamental right to one's property, a right that applies whether you've signed a lease to a property and your neighbor is threatening your ability to safely enjoy that property, or you're a property owner and you're powerless to remove a tenant who hasn't paid rent for 2.5 years. So next time you hear housing is a human right, I want you to think about the Bellevue story and ask, who pays? Who pays to promise the provision of housing as an entitlement regardless of income? I'm confident that the Bellevue homeowners who just got their house back would be the first to say that if you're not paying with your own home, you're paying with your hard-earned money, and ultimately you're paying with your freedom.